For decades, official history repeated the same version, that Bruce Lee was just a genius actor, a visionary fighter, and a spontaneous cultural symbol. But, in forgotten archives, uncatalogued records and private correspondence that has never been made public, there is another narrative, one that few have had access to and that almost no one has dared to tell. Behind the scenes of productions that involved studios linked to power structures in the West, strange patterns emerged. Scripts changed without explanation, fight scenes edited to soften real techniques, and Eastern characters always portrayed within carefully controlled limits. It wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural architecture. In internal memos associated with the Los Angeles film industry, references appear to public perception control about martial arts, a strategy to keep the public fascinated but never truly educated. In parallel, documents originating from political influence networks during the Cold War mention the importance of neutralizing independent symbols of bodily and philosophical power. And it is exactly at this point that Bruce Lee begins to realize that something is not right. Reports from people close to him describe changes in his behavior, quieter, more attentive, studying not only combat techniques, but communication systems, propaganda, and mass psychology. He begins to question why his movements were censored, why his philosophy was watered down, why his image was molded. What did he discover? And what did you try to reveal? Was not just a distortion of his art. It was a whole system trying to decide what you can learn and what you should never understand. This is the story that was left out of the films, and it starts now. At the height of his international rise, Bruce Lee believed that he had finally gained enough freedom to express his martial philosophy fully. He was no longer just an actor. He was a thinker on the move, someone who saw martial arts as a universal language of individual freedom. But it was precisely at this moment that the first cracks appeared in the surface of what seemed to be just the entertainment industry. It all started with seemingly small details, last-minute script changes, subtle instructions to simplify certain movements, insistent requests to reduce philosophical explanations about combat. At first, they just seemed like creative decisions. But Bruce was trained to notice patterns, and the patterns began to repeat themselves. In private meetings with producers linked to major studios in Los Angeles, Bruce heard terms that did not belong to the artistic vocabulary: cultural accessibility, impact control, balance of public perception. They were strange expressions for someone who just wanted to choreograph fights. Even stranger was the fact that these guidelines appeared whenever he tried to show more direct, more efficient techniques that reflected the core of Jeet Kune Do. On one specific occasion, after a recording, Bruce watched the final edited version of a scene he had choreographed with surgical precision. The version shown was different. Blows had been softened, movements had been shortened, and the logic of combat had been transformed into spectacle, not truth. When he asked, he received a vague answer: "It's better for the public." But Bruce wasn't convinced. He started investigating on his own. He talked to stuntmen, editors, production assistants. Some avoided responding. Others, clearly uncomfortable, mentioned directives coming from higher up. People who never showed up on sets but whose decisions shaped everything. Over time, he realized it wasn't just about cinema. Magazines, TV shows, interviews, they all repeated the same image of martial arts: exotic, mysterious, visually impressive, but always limited to a safe caricature. Never too dangerous, never too transformative, never too liberating. Bruce started connecting the dots, and the more it connected, the more unsettling the conclusion became. There was an invisible filter deciding what the world could understand about physical power, mental discipline, and personal autonomy. For someone whose central philosophy was absorb what is useful and reject what is useless, realizing that there were forces trying to decide what was allowed to be absorbed was more than a professional frustration. It was a direct threat to what he believed in. From that moment on, his search was no longer just artistic. It became investigative, strategic, almost silent. But the question that begins to arise, and that would change everything, is: how did this information affect Bruce Lee? When Bruce Lee began to delve beneath the surface, he realized that he wasn't just dealing with isolated creative decisions. There was a method, discrete, repetitive, almost invisible, that was repeated in different studios, scripts, and publicity campaigns. The first pillar of this structure was visual enchantment. The choreographies were designed to impress, not to teach. Rapid sequences, amplified movements, spectacular blows, all designed to generate admiration, but without replicable technical logic. To the average viewer, it seemed like genius. To an experienced practitioner, it was a carefully edited illusion. The second pillar was philosophical dilution. Whenever Bruce tried to insert Jeet Kune Do principles, direct efficiency, economy of movement, adaptation without rigidity, the scripts were adjusted, speeches were cut, monologues replaced by vague phrases about honor or destiny. Philosophy was kept on the surface, never at the depth where it could transform the way someone thinks and acts. The third pillar was the most subtle, cultural caricature. Martial arts were presented as something distant, almost mystical, associated with secret temples, enigmatic masters, and exotic rituals. This created fascination, but it also established a psychological barrier. The public admired it, but did not see itself as capable of learning or applying it. Over time, Bruce realized that these three elements, spectacle, dilution, and exoticization, formed a kind of closed circuit of perception. The audience was kept enchanted, engaged, consuming, but never truly empowered. And then the whispers came. Behind the scenes, among technicians and stuntmen, comments circulated that some decisions didn't just come from studio executives. There was talk of external consultants, people who reviewed scripts based on cultural impact. Nobody knew exactly who they were. Some said they had connections with government institutions. Others claimed they were just market experts. But the pattern was always the same. Whenever something became too real, it was adjusted. Some theories began to gain traction among the few who watched closely, that there was a strategic interest in preventing efficient combat techniques from becoming too popular, that movements towards physical and mental autonomy could generate less predictable, less controllable individuals. That mass culture was being used as a pedagogical filter, showing enough to fascinate, but not enough to liberate. Bruce never confirmed any of these theories publicly, but he never ignored them either. In private meetings, he began to ask uncomfortable questions. In interviews, he began to choose words more carefully. In his training, he further deepened his search for simplicity and functional truth, almost as if he was trying to preserve something before it was distorted. But the turning point came when he gained access to a specific set of internal documents, materials that should not have left certain rooms, audience reports, representation guidelines, psychological analyses of audience reception. And in the middle of these documents, a phrase was repeated with small variations. Keep audiences engaged through admiration, not replication. That wasn't theory. It was communication policy. From then on, Bruce understood that he wasn't just inside an entertainment system. He was within a projected narrative. And it was at that moment that he began to consider something that had never crossed his mind before. What if the only way to preserve the truth was to get out of the game and expose who controls it? There was a limit that Bruce Lee had never crossed, that of accessing information that did not belong to the world of cinema. Until, through an unlikely sequence of contacts, a fired editor, a frustrated consultant, and an assistant who decided to talk too much, he arrived at a set of documents that should not have been in civilian hands. They didn't have a studio tone, no production company logo. They were memos dating from the height of the Cold War, with cold, technical language, focused on cultural influence and public perception management, the kind of material that rarely appears outside of restricted archives. At first, they seemed like generic analyses of cinema, advertising, and mass behavior. But as Bruce progressed through the pages, specific references emerged to martial arts, their growing popularity in the West, and, most disturbingly, the psychological impact that independent figures could have on youth. One sentence in particular was underlined by hand in one of the copies. Independent symbols of bodily and philosophical power must be monitored and, when necessary, neutralized through media recontextualization. Bruce reread that line several times. It wasn't just about him. It was about anyone who represented physical autonomy, mental clarity, and independence of thought outside of controllable structures. And, at that historical moment, he fit that description perfectly. The documents described indirect strategies, never open confrontations. Instead of censoring, reinterpret. Instead of banning, dilute. Turn potentially transformative ideas into harmless entertainment. Convert masters into characters. convert philosophy into slogan. And there was more. Attached reports analyzed public reception of different types of martial arts representation. When techniques were realistically presented and explained, there was an increase in interest in practical training and philosophical study. When they were presented in a stylized and mystical way, interest remained high, but restricted to passive consumption. The recommendations were clear. Prioritize the second model. Bruce realized that this explained years of small decisions that he had only considered weird. These were not isolated decisions. They were guidelines aligned with a greater logic. But what disturbed him most was not the existence of the strategy. It was the possibility that it was working perfectly. Because while millions of people watched his scenes, repeated his screams, and admired his movements, very few really understood what he was trying to teach. Simplicity, efficiency, freedom of form, absence of mental rigidity. He began to wonder how many times it had been used as a vehicle of fascination, when its intention was to be a vector of liberation. And then the question arose that changed his stance for good. If these documents were right, then his public image was not just a result of success. It was also the result of strategic curation. In the following days, Bruce began to act with unusual caution. Meetings were avoided. Certain calls were not returned. Projects were reevaluated. He began recording ideas in personal notebooks, as if he were preparing something bigger, something that wouldn't depend on approval from studios or intermediaries. People close to him noticed the change. He seemed more focused, quieter, but also more determined, like someone who finally understood the board he was playing on. And at the center of that board was a choice few artists face. Remain the image that the system accepts, or risk everything to reveal the system behind the image. What Bruce Lee decided to do with this discovery is something that never appeared in any film credits. But the signs began to emerge, discreet, almost imperceptible, for those who knew where to look. What no one realized at the time, and which is only now starting to make sense, is that Bruce Lee never tried to confront the system directly. He did something much smarter, and much more dangerous for those who depended on that invisible control. He infiltrated the truth within the illusion itself. Instead of publicly denouncing the documents he had found, which would probably put him in immediate discredit, Bruce began to subtly alter the way he constructed his scenes, his lines, and even his interviews. He started to insert micro-fragments of reality into the show. In some fight sequences, real movements began to appear for fractions of a second, so fast that the common public did not notice it, but attentive practitioners recognized it. In apparently simple dialogues, he hid deep concepts of efficiency, freedom, and adaptation. In interviews, he answered questions with metaphors that seemed too philosophical for television, but that, to anyone paying attention, were coded instructions. He turned every public appearance into a subliminal transmission field. The system continued to display Bruce Lee as a fascinating icon, but beneath the surface, he was planting seeds of understanding in anyone willing to go beyond the obvious. The big turnaround was not an explosive accusation. It was a silent subversion. Bruce realized he didn't need to destroy the machine to beat it. All that was needed was to use the machine itself as a vehicle for something it could not completely control: the individual consciousness of those who observed it carefully. And there is a detail that few noticed. In his latest projects and personal records, there is a change of emphasis. Less focus on proving superiority, more focus on awakening perception. As if he knew that his time was limited, and that his mission was not to teach everyone directly, but to leave enough clues for the right ones to find their way. This raises an unsettling possibility. What if part of what you've always seen as entertainment has actually always been an invitation in disguise to look beyond what's shown? The official story ends with the death of Bruce Lee, but this other narrative suggests that his work was never interrupted. It just changed form, existing between the lines, in the details, in the moments when you decide to question what you're seeing. And now that you know this behind-the-scenes version, the question stops being about him and becomes about you. What else are you watching every day, without realizing what is actually being communicated? If you want to continue exploring stories like this, which connect culture, power, perception, and the behind-the-scenes that rarely come to light, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because some truths are not hidden. They just hope that someone is prepared to see them.